Today's podcast promises to be unbelievable. This is based on a podcast that I listened to about a year ago, still going on, and it will change the way you think about everything. Let's start here. Can children with autism read our minds or see into the future? Can they know a foreign language they've never been taught, communicate with friends on the other side of the globe without ever leaving their room or picking up a phone? The answer, my next guest says, is yes. This will make you reconsider everything you think you know about autism, the brain, ESP, human consciousness, everything. Welcome, author, researcher, psychiatrist, whose work has shook the nation and me personally in the mind-bending Telepathy Tapes. This is Dr. Diane Hennacy. Diane, welcome to the program. I am so excited to have you on. Your Telepathy Tapes has totally opened my mind up into areas that are not just medical advancements or understanding and having more empathy, but also spiritually. I mean, your work is touching on it's game changing. It's absolutely game changing. And I don't know why I don't know why you're not a household name right now with everyone. I really don't. So welcome.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Can we start? Because I want to take people who haven't necessarily heard about this, and I want to start really kind of at the beginning. So if you don't mind, let me just kind of see if I can have you guide you through piecing all of this together. You're educated Harvard, Johns Hopkins. You study ESP, and you were at Cambridge Hospital, right? And there was a patient that came in. They thought she was going to have a heart attack, and she said, "No, I'm not having a heart attack." What happened?
Well, that was when I was a consultant to the medical floors.
Okay.
And if somebody on one of the medical floors is mentally ill, they can't leave the hospital against medical advice. And this woman wanted to leave. She said that she was seeing ghosts and that she was psychic and already knew that the test would come back normal. And so she just wanted to leave. And so they called me in basically to evaluate her and sign the paperwork and keep her there. And so when I went to see her, she told me she was seeing ghosts. And I said, yeah, I bet if there's any place that there's ghosts, it's probably in a hospital. And she laughed and she said, I like you. And she said, I'm getting a reading about you. Do you mind if I share with you what I'm seeing? And I said, yeah, go ahead. I thought, I'll just, kind of, get a sense of, how delusional she was by what she told me about me. And the first thing that she said was, your husband's a chemist. And my husband was a biochemist. And then she said, and he's applying for a position in 2 different cities right now. And he was applying for postdoctorates in biochemistry that very week. And then she told me that we'd end up in San Diego, which was one of the cities.
Wow.
It is where we ended up. And she told me other things about my life that unfolded.
Okay, so how deeply were you into ESP and all of this? And how much of it did you think was real at this point?
Oh, at that point, I was totally in the materialist model of neuroscience. I was a neuroscientist as an undergraduate. I trained in neuropsychiatry. And in my training, that we were taught that if somebody says that they can read other people's minds, or if they can read the future, or if they see ghosts, that's a sign of a psychosis, and that they would need medication. Right. And so this was totally antithetical to everything that I had believed.
What did that do to you?
I'm sorry?
What did that do to you?
Well, what it did to me was it raised my curiosity. because I didn't have any need for things to be one way or the other. I'm a really I was basically raised to be a scientist. My father had graduate degrees in 3 different branches of science. He was the head of the artificial heart program at Battelle Memorial.
Wow.
I was raised with science kits, and I just thought at the time that I was in my 20s, the most exciting frontier was really understanding the brain and consciousness. And I already had studied physics and was aware of the fact that physicists over 100 years ago had told us that reality is not the way that we perceive it.
Right.
That reality is, whether you're looking at Einstein's theory of relativity or you're looking at Niels Bohr and, quantum mechanics, that you were told that this isn't the real reality. And so I thought, when I heard this, I thought, well, this is very, very similar to, first of all, I thought, if this is true, if people can read minds or predict the future, that has profound implications for everything.
But can I tell you something? This is why I like you so much. Most people they like living in the world that has been crafted, and they don't necessarily want to pursue things. I mean, that is a dangerous thing for you as a scientist and you must have known this, I'm sure you did, to say, oh, you know what? I think this ESP thing, there might be something to that. Nobody likes to go into that box because there's too many scientists that are unlike you, that are unwilling to challenge. I mean, that's what science is supposed to be. But they're unwilling to challenge the things that people think they know. They have to keep you in this box. So did you realize how scary this was going to be for you?
Absolutely, 100%. I really made a lot of sacrifices.
I bet you
in
did.
Order to,
You lost your license at one point.
I'm sorry?
You lost your license.
Why? Yeah, well, and before that, I walked away from a successful academic career. I mean, not only, as a child was I groomed to become a scientist, but I was groomed to become, at some point, like a chairman of a department. I mean, here I was, I was on faculty at, Harvard. And then after that, I was part of a think tank that met at the Salk Institute that had all these Nobel laureates in science there. And that was like sort of like the pinnacle of, for me, was to be at a place where I was working with great minds. And when I was at Johns Hopkins, I was trained by the best of the best. I mean, the person who taught me neuroscience there was Vernon Mountcastle, and he's the person who mapped out the visual cortex in chimpanzees.
Jeez.
And I went to Johns Hopkins precisely because I wanted to work with the best of the best. I went to the Institute of Psychiatry in London and studied with Sir Michael Rudder back in 1987, and he was the world's expert on autism. And I went to Queen Square, which is the Mecca for neurologists.
Did you ever
I really wanted to be, a top scientist. And then what I discovered when I got into these institutions was that there was a certain ossification of thought.
They're afraid. They're afraid, aren't they? And doesn't it breed more fear? Because look, everybody wants to be popular. Everybody wants to be on the in crowd. Nobody ever says, you know what, I want to be a pariah. You want to be popular. And so everything is set up in the world for you to want to be accepted, especially by whatever tribe it is you want to be a part of. And when you go against that tribe, but science should be different. Science should be holding the people up who say, you know what, this is very risky, but it has to be said, we don't know. For years, people said there's no way, God doesn't play dice. Well, look at quantum computing right now. It is real. We just don't have any idea how it works. We're infants playing with the universe and we have no idea what we're doing, but somehow or another we're arrogant enough just to keep saying, no, we know exactly how it works. And we don't.
Right, right. And, I think that, well, first of all, I mean, my father was somebody who was doing really cutting edge work. I mean, before he became a cardiovascular physiologist, he was doing research at Hanford. He was doing work to see what the biological effects of plutonium were, and his work helped
Wow.
to end the testing that was being done.
Wow.
And then
So is that
after
what
doing
gave you
that,
courage? Is that what gave you courage to stand? You think your parents, your
a
upbringing?
lot of it, a lot of it is my parents. Yeah, my father. I'll never forget when I was in seventh grade. My father wanted to see my science book, and he saw that it said in there that a frog had four chambers to their heart. And here my father was the head of the artificial heart program,
Right.
and he had a laboratory when I was a kid. He had a laboratory in the basement that he would monitor animals after he had done surgery on them, and when he was designing parts,
Jeez.
and so I knew if anybody knew about how many chambers that there were in the heart,
Right.
it was my father. And he said, "But this is wrong." And I said, I'm like, "How can that be?" And he said, "You can't believe everything you read, that there are
Mm.
mistakes." And so I remember when I took my test, and sure enough, they had a question about how many chambers were in the heart of a frog. And I had to put down three. And I got it marked wrong. But I was that was like that says something about my personality,
Yes.
even in seventh grade, where I knew I had to make a choice, and I would choose to put down what I knew was the truth rather than what was a lie,
Wow.
because I knew that they expected me to write down three. I mean, to write down four instead of
Wow.
three.
That is such an important lesson for everybody today. How many people are going through school and they're just like, just write down what they want you to write down. That's not the right thing to do. So let me just go back real quick, because what you have to share is so fascinating, but I'm fascinated by you. You got your license back. You lost your license, and then you got your license back. That's still used to discredit you by some. Well, she lost her license, but you got your license back. Can you quickly just tie that story up?
Oh, sure. So what happened is I wrote a book titled "The ESP Enigma: A Scientific Case for Psychic Phenomena." And in that book, what I did was I described how incomplete the model of neuroscience was. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if anybody should know that, it would be me, having
Mm-hmm.
trained as a neuroscientist. I discussed the physics that was over 100 years old and the implications of that. And then I also basically gave several examples of research that had been done by parapsychologists over the past century that had positive results, and results that were statistically significant, that so significant that they surpassed that of other branches of science that have accepted
Mm.
other data. And so I'm just like, there's a prejudice against this. And so that's why I wrote that book. And what happened was, after somebody reported me to the medical board for something that was really a trivial thing that I thought was going to go away. I mean, a patient that I had been taking care of had gotten a medical marijuana card, and he was somebody who, if he used marijuana, it would make him become manic.
Mm-hmm.
And he became manic, and he refused to stop smoking the marijuana. And so he started doing strange things in public that embarrassed the family. And so they reported me to the board thinking I didn't know what I was doing.
Oh.
And what happened, though, is that a lot of people don't realize that medical boards are administrative law courts, and they don't work like the rest of the judicial system. In a criminal proceeding or a civil law, you're guilty. You're innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
And in administrative law courts, it's the opposite. You're guilty
Mm-hmm.
until proven innocent. And so what happened is that this psychiatrist reported to the board that because I had written a book on ESP, and she hadn't read it, she just saw the title. Because I'd written a book on ESP, I must be engaging in magical thinking.
Wow.
And I think what it is that really, what the board is thinking is like, to even give ESP any credibility at all is such an insane thing to do. This woman must be insane.
Yeah.
And so you really can't be mentally ill and practice psychiatry. So they're like, we've got to pull her license right away because she's seeing patients.
And how'd you get it back?
So I got it back 3 months later at the next board meeting. And how I got it back was I underwent 3 days of intensive testing. Everything from personality testing to IQ testing and Rorschach. And I even had to see a neurologist to make sure that I didn't have a brain tumor because, or something medically wrong with me to make me psychotic. So, I got a clean bill of health. And so they really couldn't justify keeping my license away from me based on my mental health anymore.
I have to tell you, I don't want to compare it to this at all in any way, but I'm reminded of the Ghostbusters where the women were the Ghostbusters. I don't know if you saw it, but one of them wrote a book on ESP and she had a great career and she was just discredited by it. But anyway, I digress. Sorry to get there. More in just a second. First, the seasons are shifting. The air is getting cooler. The days are getting shorter. And while you're switching out your wardrobe or putting an extra blanket on the bed, something else is happening as well. Something you won't see until it's already inside. Out there in the leaves and the mulch and the crawl spaces, pests are on their move. And spiders, the ants, the silverfish, all of it is, they're coming looking for the same thing, a warm place to hide out for the winter. And unless you make it clear they're not welcome, that place might be your house. Moxie Pest Control knows exactly how this plays out because they've been through it 1,000 times. And they don't just show up and spray your house. They plan, they strategize, they build a perimeter. They protect what's yours from everything that isn't. This is not about bugs. This is about the line between what's out there and what belongs inside your home. The seasons may change, but your peace of mind doesn't have to. Right now, celebrate 25 years in the business, and you can get your first pest control service for just $25. Visit moxieservices.com/Beck and use the promo code Beck. Okay, let me go back to you going back in the 80s. You go to England. You're studying with the guy who is the leading guy on autism. And you're coming back here and you're told there's just not enough cases of autism to really do anything with this information to be able to continue to study here, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was at that time it was, maybe, 1 or 2 per 10,000 children.
So what has happened? I know this is a big question. But what has happened since then to now? Are we diagnosing more? Is more happening? I know we'll get into this later, but I know you say it's overdiagnosed or misdiagnosed in several different ways. You say there's different forms or faces of it. But what has happened since then?
Well, it is. So I would say that it's a combination of everything. And that's part of why it's such a confusing area for people. I think that back in the 80s, it was underdiagnosed.
Okay.
And
Is that because we didn't know what it was?
Well, so here's the thing. Okay. Back in the 80s, we had three subcategories of autism. It was before it all was lumped together as autism spectrum disorder. So back in the 80s, we talked about Asperger's syndrome and pervasive developmental disorder and autism. Mm-hmm. And they really were 3 different conditions. And Asperger's is really more this sort of really kind of nerdy, introverted, socially awkward sort of individual.
Peter Thiel. I met him.
Well, I'm not going to say anything.
Well, I met him. You just described him.
Yeah. So, but it's a diagnosis that goes back to the World War II actually. Right. So anyway, and so then we also had autism, And autism was described by Leo Kanner, and a couple of the children in that study of 11 children had regressed during development. And but the others were the children of extremely bright, highly educated individuals, and were really more kind of, like what we think of as Asperger's. And so what happened is that Asperger's it was not pathologized. It's just sort of like, well, that's just kind of, the kid that's sort of a loner, they're really bright and, a little eccentric, but it wasn't, turned into a psychiatric disorder. And there's a huge difference between, and so I would say that was underdiagnosed. We're now diagnosing people like that with Asperger's, and in fact, it's almost become popular to say on the spectrum.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but then the regressive form, that's what's increased that's where we've really seen the true increase in numbers is in that regressive form, and we're also seeing more of the Asperger's because you have more and more. There's something called assortative mating, where you have individuals tend to be attracted to other people that are like them. And so, I mean, if you go back 100 years when we were less mobile and women weren't going to college as much as they are now, you didn't have the sort of more Asperger, type, male meeting a woman that was a little more like that. And so what you've had more and more of these pairings of people.
Yeah.
And so you're having these children.
And that's what wasn't it? I'm trying to remember the author of the bell curve, but I think he talks about that, how society changed and you started having pairings where it used to be maybe an intellectual, but married to somebody who wasn't an intellectual, but now everybody started going to the same way. And so you think that played a role?
I think that played a role. Yeah. But then the other thing, though, is these kids whose development is being disrupted right at the time that they're starting to become social beings and develop language, which those are the two criteria for something being autism, is that you have some developmental anomaly in their language and social skills. And so that's that age that, between, 1.5 and 2.5, where we're developing language, we're really starting to really test out our separateness, from, that individuation separation stage of Piaget. And so when something happens to interrupt development, then you're getting somebody who's being diagnosed as autistic. But there's a lot of things that can disrupt development then.
Right.
I mean, and there's a lot of things that are in our environment now that were not in our environment before and get released into the environment without testing to see how do they affect brain development. Because it's sort of like you can't really ethically do those tests.
Right.
But then when you're releasing things into the environment that can have those effects, then I believe that we're obligated to try to figure out what's what. And
isn't that kind of what I really want to get to the telepathy part of this because it's so crazy, game changing. But I don't want to just brush this off. This is kind of what JFK or RFK is doing now, right? I mean, do you have any thoughts on the Tylenol stuff or our food? And I don't want to get deeply into it, but that's the kind of stuff. Maybe not that specific, but that's the kind of stuff you're talking about. We have a responsibility to look for these things, right?
We do have a responsibility to look at these things, and I appreciate that that's finally happening now.
Yeah, right.
And I think that in a way, what they've announced already is some of the low-hanging fruit.
He's been made into a nut job for even saying if that's the low-hanging fruit. Wait until we get to the hard fruit to pick, because they've just torn him apart. They're doing to him what they did to you.
I know. And I really respect, I must say that, it's inspiring to see, other people who like me are willing to, take the slings and arrows and because, you're doing the right thing. And I care deeply about children and our future generations. And I really, and I care about humanity. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want us to go extinct. And in many ways, I think that these children with these developmental disorders are, they're like the canaries in the coal mine.
So let me ask you, because I read something years ago that I don't remember who said it, but it just stuck with me, and I wondered it as I was listening to the telepathy tapes. Some researcher said that he felt there was a possibility that some who are diagnosed with autism are actually a step ahead on the evolutionary scale. That they are adapting, to something that is coming. What I pulled from that was that we are that autism may be not a curse, but it may be a blessing that we just don't understand yet. Does that sound reasonable, or is that crazy?
No, it's very reasonable. Absolutely. I think that one of the features of these autistic individuals is that their cognitive style is different than ours. So the highest percentage of people are what are called verbal thinkers. The way that they think is in a very, analytical, linear way. And the autistic individuals have predominantly either what's called visual spatial thinking or pattern recognition as their process. And those are superior to verbal thinking. And one of the reasons why they're superior to verbal thinking is that, first of all, they're faster. It's like the difference between a digital computer and a quantum computer.
Wow.
It's gestalt thinking, where you just see the whole thing at once, as opposed to having to figure it out bit by bit. People who have visual spatial thinking, they can, like Nikola Tesla, they can design something in their mind and analyze it from every angle, test it out and everything before they even build it.
Correct.
And then pattern thinkers, and I'm a pattern thinker.
I think I am too.
They're the ones who connect the dots.
Yes.
And so that's what we need now. We need the problem with the verbal processing is not only is it slow, but it can be deceptive.
In what way?
Look at how we can rationalize and talk ourselves into believing a lot of things that are not true.
Yes.
And so that source of knowledge, where it comes from what you build an argument for.
It's
like what a lot of attorneys do and politicians do. Everybody, they sell you on a bit of bill of goods. They make a rational, and you follow it and you go, oh yeah. And that's the primrose path. And if that's your source of knowledge versus knowledge where it's just like, boom, I see it all fits together.
Correct.
Everything converges into this thing that's closer to truth.
So
what we need to solve the problems today is that kind of thinking.
More in just a second. First, Medicare costs are a silent thief. Thousands of your dollars just vanish if you pick the wrong plan. And there's a lot of Americans out there who have been taken in by slick advisors promising great plans, only to find out later that things like their co-pays are now bleeding them dry. Chapter is different. I've met with these people personally. They founded the whole company specifically because their own parents got taken in with terrible Medicare programs, and they just trusted. And when they found out, they were in Silicon Valley, and they were like, we have to turn AI into something that can help so this doesn't happen to other people's parents. Chapter is what they started. And they don't just guide you. They search every single plan from every carrier. And it's done with technology so sharp it cuts through all of the noise. These are licensed advisors, and they have no hidden agendas. They're not working for any of these insurance carriers, okay? other Medicare advisors cherry pick plans that pad their pockets. Chapter puts you first. Dial pound 250, say the keyword chapter. It's pound 250 keyword chapter, or go to askchapter.org/Beck. There's a book about security, and it's by Gavin DeBecker, and it's called The Gift of Fear. And I think this is what have you read it?
Mm-mm.
Okay. And he talks about fear is a gift if you begin to listen to it, not over fear, but dogs bark for a reason. We will always say, you know what, that serial killer lived next door to me for years, and yeah, they were a little off, but I just never saw this coming. But the dog probably barked every time because there's a gift of fear, but we rationalize it out. And so we dismiss too many of the things that are actually important not to dismiss. But I think that's kind of what you're talking about here. So when you have somebody, and let's talk specifically how you got in with this group and started finding what you found. These kids or people that you have been studying, is it that they couldn't speak, and so it's kind of like when if you're blind, they say your hearing becomes more acute because you have to. Is it that they couldn't speak and so they found different ways, or did they find different ways for some reason and that just caused them to not communicate that way? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, during the first, our brain remains what we call plastic for our whole life in terms of its ability to remodel itself. But it is really, plastic in the beginning, those first 4 years.
Right.
And so, really what you're doing in the learning process is you're basically sculpting your brain. And there are certain things that are essential, functions that, and one of them is navigation. And so that's why if you have people that are born blind, they'll oftentimes be able to navigate using their auditory system. There's a famous echolocator named Daniel Kish, who basically he emits clicks, and and then he's able to map out
crazy
the world, and even mountain climb, ride a bike, and all of this stuff, using the information he gets from the waves, the coming back, bouncing off his environment. And so, and that's really what we do is we, our brains decode information that's contained in waves, whether they're sound waves or light waves. And so another essential function is communication. And when you are a child, you're dependent upon the other for everything. Communication is critical.
Correct.
And being social, we want to know kind of what are other people thinking,
Right.
and so like navigation, communication is that important. And if you're deprived of the typical communication, then you use what I think is a default system. And I think that what they're using is if you could think of it as almost like a proto-language that, that they're able to access information, just like, for example, dogs can pick things up.
Right.
It's a more primal sense that I think we all have. But what happens is it gets buried. It gets buried, and it atrophies to some extent because we don't use it.
Because they're using it, is that how they grow? Because you talk and you demonstrate. It's amazing what you demonstrate. They know history, they know philosophy, things they never learned, they were never exposed to. So is that
Right.
just because they didn't filter all these things out, and so this skill grew, or what? Where is that coming from?
Well, okay, so what you're talking about is something called Savant syndrome, which comes from the Latin savar, which means to know. And there are cases that go back hundreds of years.
We used to call them idiot savants, right? I'm sure that's
we
not.
used to.
Yeah, but that just meant we didn't understand them. But once you understood them, they were way ahead of everybody else.
Yeah,
right?
that name came from the fact that it's different. A savant is different from a genius in the sense that they usually have deficits somewhere. So it's sort of like you've robbed Peter to pay Paul in a way. You've given up something. Okay, but now you've got this, superpower. And so most savants are autistic. And the second most common category of savants are people who are blind. And so in both of those cases, you have something that, as I said, it takes you away from, it takes you away from the normal path to meeting those basic functions of navigation and communication, and puts you back into something that precedes that. And so with savants, there was this boy who back in the early 1800s, he was like 5 years old, hadn't even been to school, and he was like spouting, mathematical equations and solving them. and he even went around and demonstrated this to people in public.
Where do you think this is coming from? Because you're
that's what I've been working on. I've been working on a theory for that, because that's the thing, is that besides knowing about modern physics, I knew about savant syndrome because of having met Oliver Sacks back in 1986 when I was at Johns Hopkins, and he had just published this book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And he talked in that book about these two identical twins who were institutionalized, who were autistic, that he had evaluated, who could just spit out prime numbers in 6 digits, consecutive ones, back and forth. And there was no good algorithm for prime numbers. And the kids said that they weren't deriving the numbers, that they just appeared to them. They just saw the numbers. And Oliver Sacks tested them and validated their prime numbers up to 12 digits. The kids actually generated them even in 20 digits, but Sacks couldn't validate that because the computers in the 60s couldn't do it. And yet, so they exceeded computational capacity. And when I heard about savant syndrome, and I had, of course, heard about that before I met this patient at Cambridge, I was thinking, okay, this is another example. Even though it was shocking to me, I was like, this is another example of somebody knowing information that we think we shouldn't have access to, that we don't, it doesn't fit the model. And I was like, well, if I'm going to have a complete model of how the brain works, then I can't just dismiss certain phenomena. I have to be able to include them too. And so the reality is that I think that what these autistic savants are showing us is that we have a lot of things inverted in terms of the way that we think about things. It's almost like, so you think of Plato and the Platonic realm, that these idealist, philosophers talked about how, that precedes, the manifestation of something. It gets back into like, a lot of scripture and esoteric things where they say first was the word. And so it's sort of like, so it's all about kind of the art of creation, the art of manifestation.
But it also goes to more of a lack of a better term, a universal mind. It's always struck me that we invented airplanes on 3 different continents almost at the same time. You know what I mean? It's almost like there's these things where all of a sudden people can pierce through into a universal knowledge set.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. And so my model for, and my next book will be coming out in fall of 26, is really looking at the brain as being more like a device, like my smartphone that enables me to surf the cloud. That information is really not, it's
Yes.
not in here. That
Yes.
this is just my tool, and that there is that the part of the brain, the hippocampus that's involved in memory and involved in navigating physical space. I mean, people
Mm-hmm.
got a Nobel Prize, for discovering the cells in the hippocampus that are involved in our navigation of space. Well, the hippocampus is also involved in laying out memory, and I think that it helps us navigate both physical and mental space, and that mental space can be our own personal sort of field of consciousness, but we can also then, depending upon our own
Filters.
practices and
Yeah.
filters and whatnot, that we can actually go beyond that and gain access to the universal field, if you
So
will.
let me. Why don't you spend a few minutes just talking about the telepathy tapes and these kids that you found and started finding them all over the world and what they can do?
Sure. So what happened is that after I wrote my book, The ESP Enigma, I was invited to India to meet these savants because I said in the book that I thought that basically what savants were doing was the same as ESP, and I knew that savant syndrome was accepted by science. So I saw that as my sort of my foot in
You
the door,
are
my way that I
good.
could the way that I could.
Yes, you're good. You can connect the dots. I see that.
Yeah, and so I went over there to study these savants, and they had these skills that were really remarkable. This one boy, but a lot of the skills were were ESP as far as I'm concerned. This one boy, he would he would see illness in other people, and he would,
Mm.
so for example, the doctor told this story of where the boy touched this woman's breast, and he said, ma'am, he says, I want you to know you better get a mammogram because he doesn't touch people unless they have illness somewhere. And she had a mammogram, and sure enough, she had breast
Mm.
cancer in her breast. And and another child who was your sort of more typical savant, who he's like 5 years old, and he knew a lot of things in math and science that, I mean, he'd never been taught. Um, and just as I was getting ready to leave India, the woman who had worked for the government there, with these children, who had invited me over there, she said, "Oh, by the way, they're all telepathic, and they're telepathic with one another." And I'm like, "What?"
Wow.
I'm like, "Well, I would have loved to have tested for that, but I was getting ready to leave." And so I came back to the States, and I was, on various, interviews,
Yeah.
and we podcasts back then weren't, what they are today.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was like, back in 2013, and but people were familiar with my work, and I said I really wanted to test, children who were autistic, who might be telepathic, and I was contacted by this family, and they had a daughter that they said, we have a daughter who's telepathic with two different therapists who come to the home to work with her. And so Daryl Treffert and I both evaluated this child
In a
and
scientific fashion. It was really
in a scientific
the way
fashion.
you did it
Yeah,
is just
yeah,
brilliant. Very good for you.
yeah,
But go ahead.
yeah. Yeah, and so the story of this girl was that her father, who was familiar with the idea of mathematical savants, thought she was a mathematical savant because even though she didn't do regular arithmetic, she could solve very complex mathematical problems.
Mm.
And so the therapist was working with her in the home one day, and her calculator died, and so she used a different means of doing the calculation. And she used an iPad, and it wasn't in this girl's line of vision at all. And it gave the answer in logarithmic notation. And Haley spelled on her talker. She had a device where you it's like a keyboard that then gives you an electronic voice. She typed onto it the logarithmic notation instead, and the therapist was like, wait a minute, how'd you know that? And she said, well, I can see the numerators and denominators in your head. She said, basically, I'm reading your mind. And then the therapist started asking her questions that she knew the answers to, and she's like blown away. And then similarly, a second therapist who was working in the home discovered it through some accidents. And so when I went there to evaluate them, I put a visual barrier between the child and the therapist, and I had cameras through, all over the room. I had them, above and on all the walls, and then the cameraman and I were in another room, getting a feed, from the cameras that we could monitor everything. And I had already taken numbers and words and pictures and everything and had randomized them and given them to the therapist as a stack for her to one by one, turn over and see what it was, and then think it and say to Haley, okay, type in your talk or whatever it is. Yeah, yeah. And
these tests came back, and this is stunning to me. These tests come back 10 out of 10. You ask 10 questions, you get 10 right answers, right? I mean, if it was
close. I mean, it's between 90, it's between 97, percent.
Yeah, well, still, but if you had 70% right, you would think that would be on the front page of every paper. You have 97% of the time it's right. That's way beyond statistic. Anything.
Absolutely. And that's the reason why. So back up a bit. After I got my license back from the medical board, I was determined to do two things. And the first thing was I was going to find evidence that would be convincing, to the skeptics. And I knew that there was all this evidence that was out there that was, even though it was statistically significant, it wasn't like knock your socks off. So let's say if chance is that you get 25% of the answers right. And you're scoring at 35%.
Right.
I mean, nobody's going to lose sleep over that.
Right. 97% changes you.
That changes you. And I realized that these autistic savants, that they're a whole order of a magnitude better than any of the other, psychic literature out there. And I realized that with the savant skills, and then, just ergo, if that's true for the savant skills, why couldn't I then do that with, these ESP skills?
Right.
And sure enough, I found that they could.
And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, it's been a long time since I listened to it, but moms were connected more than anybody else, right? Or they would read their mothers. Maybe I'm remembering it that incorrectly, but there was something with the mothers that were thinking, my child can read my mind, and it was the moms that were either the first to discover, or there was a higher percentage that could do it with their mom. Is that right?
I'd say that typically, it is a mother, but it can also be somebody who's not related at all. It could be their speech therapist, or the ABA person that's working with them.
Right, but I mean, at first
it's someone they develop a bond with, right? Though, usually,
and if I'm not mistaken, it was first moms thinking, this is that's not even possible that we're reaching out to you, saying, I know I'm not crazy, but this sounds crazy.
Right. Yeah. So the people that reach out to me are they're typically extremely well educated, and they're reaching out to me not only because they have a child who's telepathic and they had some experience where they're going, oh my God, could an autistic kid be telepathic? And then they do a Google search, my name gets pulled up. But a lot of them, the reason why they're contacting me is that it was a shock to them. It's not that they were, themselves, came from a family where
It's,
everybody's psychic or they're woo-woo or, they're
it
into,
was you at Cambridge.
yeah, yeah, exactly. They're having it in their own home. They
Right.
can't escape from it, and they don't know what to do with it. And they're really desperate to understand what's going on. And then also they want to know, how do I raise a kid like this? Because they're like, these kids, one of the things that's funny is that they can cheat so easily in their schoolwork.
Wow.
And so the
Wow.
parents are like, how do I get them an education when all they have to
It was
do
just read it.
just
Yeah.
yeah, all they have to do is just read
See
the
it. Yeah.
teacher's mind or whatever.
That's so funny.
It's kind of like what we're faced with now with AI. People are like, how do we get
Right.
these kids to learn how to think? If they're just using AI to do the thinking for
The
them.
thing that I was really struck by, and it's always bothered me with Stephen Hawking. I love Stephen Hawking's work, and was a big fan of reading just the way his mind worked, the way he was willing to see things differently. And I thought, 40 years ago, if he would have lived 40 years earlier, everybody would have been talking to him about pudding in a very childlike voice. And he would have been trapped in his body doing three-dimensional models of the universe. And he had to be screaming. My grandfather had strokes, and I remember he could not speak, but I remember he would try, and a tear would come down his cheek. And I was very young, and I remember, you can be trapped in your body. My grandfather is in a prison of his own body. And the same thing when I saw Stephen Hawking, I'm like, oh my gosh, thank God for technology. Because he would have spent his whole life people talking down to him like he was, not there at all. And that's the thing that these kids are saying. The first thing they say is, I'm a human, I'm smart.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up because it's such an important piece of this. When I met Haley and saw this telepathy, I really wanted to understand her brain and understand what was going on. And so I wanted to understand how she learned to communicate
Mm-hmm.
doing the typing. And so I took a workshop with a couple of different people who teach that technique just so that I could see what are you
Mm-hmm.
doing here. And a light bulb went on for me when this woman who is a speech therapist on faculty at a university and somewhere on the East Coast, I don't remember right now, when she said that these children, the issue is really in their sensory motor system. It's not in their ability to understand speech. And I knew, having trained as a neuropsychiatrist, that people can have a stroke in what's called Broca's area, which is in the left frontal lobe. And that affects your expression of speech, which it also affects your expression of language in general. So
Mm-hmm.
also your ability to type is impaired as well. And and that there's another part of the brain called Wernicke's, and that's the understanding of language. And that's a more posterior part of the brain. And then there's this cable, if you will,
Yeah.
that connects the two that is not fully formed until we're 7 years old. We're myelinating the brain and developing pathways. So anyway, so it's that pathway that gets disrupted in these autistic kids who regress during the development.
So
And so they can't express the language,
correct.
but Wernicke's area, the ability to understand language, is already formed when you're born. So that didn't get disrupted.
Mm.
It's like you have it's like having the app is installed,
Wow.
but you can't use it yet. because you need some kind of cable that enables it to link to something else. And so it made sense to me that these children were just like these other individuals who I knew who'd had strokes. The problem is because it happened so early in their development, they're not given the benefit of doubt the way we would somebody that, oh, we see in the CT scan, they've got the stroke here, and therefore we'll put them in occupational therapy. We'll speech therapy. We'll try to get their speech back, and you presume that they're still intact in these other ways.
But you still don't like
we don't give these children that benefit of doubt.
My daughter had strokes at birth, and they said she would never walk or feed herself or anything else, and she's fine. She went to college, but she has a very difficult time with incoming and outgoing speech. That's where she was hit, and I feel for these parents because honestly, I feel like the worst parent in the world at times because I don't know how to communicate. It's so different, and honestly, I have spent 35 years praying every day. Help me, help me, help me. I don't know how to communicate. And all of these parents that I know that have autistic children, they're lost and they love their children. They just don't know what to do. How do you have any advice? What do we do?
Well, yeah, I am somebody who, I'm not just a scientist, I'm a clinician, and my heart really, has been so touched by these families, and looking at the challenges that they have. And so, they're it's like on the one hand, there's these amazing gifts, and then yet at the same time, there are these, significant, heart-wrenching challenges that a lot of these children have.
Yeah.
And so I have a new, I've just recently started a new nonprofit, research institute, because what I want to do is not only continue to research their gifts, I want to see how can we help them live to their fullest human potential.
And it's weird when you say that, isn't it?
I really believe that we can do that. I really do. I mean, there are certain things that I want to investigate that I think could really, really help these children. And because the pain, it goes both ways, because I have mothers who say to me, I want to know my child.
Yeah.
It's not just the heartache of the child saying, I want to know.
I know. But when you say, we want to help them live to their fullest, I have to tell you, I did a lot of work with Special Olympics when I was younger. And I walked away from that experience saying, they're not the ones with special needs. I'm the one with special needs. The way they connect with love and the world and everything else, I wish I was more like that. So when you say, I want them to live their fullest human experience, I'm a little afraid of that in a way, because you don't want to take, the worst thing we can do is teach our kids how to live like if they have this special gift, to teach them how to live like us. You know what I mean?
Oh, no, that's
right.
And I am not saying at all that I want them to be like us at all.
Right.
Okay. What I'm talking about is that a lot of them have physical pain. Yeah, they're not, and so they have really bad days sometimes because they're in so much pain that they will engage in self-destructive behaviors just to
make the pain go away.
Just to have a different pain to focus on.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. I know that they. So you can't lump them all together. Okay?
No, I know.
You have some children that don't have physical pain. Okay, and so what I'm talking about is that they have medical issues, underlying medical issues that I really believe that we could address their medical issues and not take away their gifts. I think that their gifts are, and I have, I have reason to, believe that. I mean, it's not just theoretical. I mean, there are children who've gotten their medical conditions, under better control.
Yeah.
And what they have is they have more autonomy. Like, for example, this one boy, he had a fecal transplant because oftentimes the problem is in the gut with the microbiome, and he had a fecal transplant. When one of his older siblings is the donor, and now he can go in the kitchen and cook himself something. That's huge.
It's huge.
Be able to ride a bike, it's huge, and so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. But he's still telepathic with his mother. Because a lot of these children they don't want to be like us,
right?
But they still desire some of the same things. Sure. They want to get married, they want to have children, they want to get an education.
It's like we were saying at the beginning, nobody wants to be an outcast. You want to be like everybody else to some degree. Final segment with the good doctor here in just a second. First, one of the things that I have learned is that the simplest solutions are usually the best. And when it comes to hearing, simplicity really matters. I have heard from friends who are so frustrated with hearing aids, the tiny little buttons that you hear, or the apps on their phone, and you're constantly, technology just doesn't make sense sometimes. Finally, somebody has fixed it. It's called the Atom X, and it's from Audien. This is the world's first over-the-counter touchscreen hearing aid. A real touchscreen built right into the case, no fiddling, no squinting, just, no little gadgets. Tap the screen, adjust, and you're instantly hearing better. The Atom X, it was designed by audiologists to understand real people. It's simple, it's clear, it's ready right out of the box. No prescription, no waiting, no frustration. Traditional hearing aids, they cost thousands of dollars. Audien hearing aids start at $98, and they'll give you the clarity you need for family dinners, church, TV, whatever. Don't wait. Visit audienhearing.com. Take control of your hearing today. Can you take us to the Hill?
Sure. Yeah. So the Hill is a concept that I first heard about when I was in Atlanta, and I met Houston, and he was this in his early 20s, this autistic boy that very telepathic with his mother, Katie, and they're in the Telepathy Tapes, and they were friends with Libby, who is a speech therapist who had an autistic son named John Paul, and John Paul and Houston both said that they went to the Hill, and their mother said that they go into their room and they'll put like pillows over their head or whatever. And then they'll go and they'll talk with all of these other non-speaking autistic kids on this hill. And, and it's a not, the way it was described is it's this non-physical place. So it's more, it's more in the
spiritual realm.
It's in the spiritual realm, yeah. And they say it's guarded by angels, and that they go there and they're taught by the angels, and they teach each other, and that it's a lot of fun. It sounds very blissful, and peaceful. And I thought when I first heard of it, I thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. But, I just thought it because John Paul and Houston knew each other. The fact that they were both talking about it didn't really mean that much to me. But then what happened is that these other individuals in totally different parts of the country started saying, mentioned their kid going to the Hill. And so then it became obvious that this is a thing. And if you look at spiritual traditions, the Eastern spiritual traditions, they talk about a place that sounds just like the Hill, and it really is a spiritual realm that you can go to when you reach a certain
place
level of spiritual development. Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, and and so, and so that's what I think, it's like, in a way, I think that we all come from the hill. Okay. And what happens is as we identify more and more with this identity that, as Diane or Glenn or whoever, identify with that, we become more and more disconnected from the source that we come from. We become, whether you want to say that we become disconnected from God or we become disconnected from, whatever you want to call that, we become disconnected from the divine, and we become more and more immersed in the minutia of daily life and thinking about what I want, what
Right.
what I think, and it's this divisive sort of mentality. And so I see it as that we come from the hill and we sort of descend down the hill. And now what we need to do is we need to learn how to climb the hill back up. We need to learn how to, and I think that these autistic kids, it's almost like they're our Sherpa guides to the hill.
It's I've always, I believe, my faith teaches too, that we're born forgetful, but we know who we are, but our goal in life is to remember, just remember, and everything in life is crowding it out and help you forget, and you can get really lost. But it's I found your work to be extraordinarily spiritual. Don't know exactly how I feel about things on everything, but I found it to be it just all rang true to me. Did you get to a point to where you're like, I don't know how I know this, but I know this to be true?
Oh, 100%. I mean, there's a certain, the way that everything just all fits together. There's a confidence that I have that's a knowing. I mean, a lot of these things, it's not just a belief, it's a knowing. I've been a truth seeker my whole life, and I started out as in the scientific paradigm. And the deeper I got into science, the more and more spiritual I became, because I just saw how exquisite
God has.
nature is.
I don't understand how science doesn't understand that God has got to be the world's greatest scientist. If God exists, he is unbelievably precise. What? How do you miss that? They go hand in glove.
It's tremendous hubris for us to think that we could ever design anything
like it
that is better.
Yeah.
We've designed things that are poor imitations of. And so one of the things that's so sad to me is that so many of us who become scientists, we get attracted to science because of the basic sciences.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really studying, the nature of reality. Okay. And then what happens is that when you go and you get a job, you have to apply that science. And usually you're not getting paid unless the application results in some product that's going to make money for somebody.
Right.
And so the people who fell in love with chemistry are then having to be, they go into pharmaceutical industry, or, people that fall in love with physics have to go into the defense industry, or, and we get channeled into these applications, and the basic sciences are poorly funded, just like the arts. And I think that it's because of both of those trends in our educational system that we have the world that we have today. If we brought back more arts into the educational system, then we would have a more balanced brain.
I think
that's not just focused on left hemisphere kinds of processing. And similarly, if we taught the beauty of nature and whatnot, we'd have more of an appreciation for the natural world.
I have to tell you, I agree with you. I think I agree with you. I think it is. I mean, science has hurt itself so horribly in the last 5 years, 6 years with the rigid, it's this way, don't even question science. It's the hubris that I think hurts science. Science should be all about discovery and, oh my gosh, what if this is true, what else is possible? You know, we learn something about the brain and then that's absolutely true. And you're like, no, you know, have you not learned anything from science? It's only true until it's not true, until we learn the next step. And then that doesn't make that not true. It just means you're on the road to truth. Science is always on the road to truth. There is no destination. You know what I mean? You never arrive. Stop saying you've arrived at the truth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a process.
Yes.
It's a process, and you put a theory out there as your best approximation of the truth, and then your job as a scientist is actually to try to disprove it. You know, the null hypothesis in the scientific method is that you say, okay, can I disprove this?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of science moves forward by saying, well, I can't disprove that.
Right.
So that's still the operating theory. Well, when you start getting some of these exceptions that tell you that something's wrong with your theory, it's no longer science if you're sticking to your theory.
Right. Exactly right.
And it's more what like Rupert Sheldrake calls scientism. You know, it's as dogmatic as some of the most dogmatic religions because they become more wedded to that belief system than to what really is the truth. And
I agree with I don't understand how science doesn't understand they're no longer Galileo, they're the Catholic Church. You know what I mean? That locking him up in the tower. You know, you can't say that. Well, you want the truth or you don't want the truth. I'm not going to change it, but I mean, it's weird how we always seem to lose the balance of things. And I think that's arts and science is what you were talking about.
Yeah. We really need to have, we need to be also stimulating curiosity in kids. You know, school is not a pleasant experience for them. No. And for me, I mean, my father, I may have been, it's hard for me to separate out, what was like my natural nature versus how much of it was the influence of my father. But I just know that I was always curious, and I still am. I mean, when I went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, one of the things they said to us. And Johns Hopkins was a very, very unusual medical school. I mean, they wanted people who would be the ones who were going to be doing cutting edge stuff. You know, that's the reputation of Johns Hopkins. And I remember being told very early on, half of what you're going to learn here, by the time your career is over, you'll find out is incorrect. And it's your job to try to figure out which half's right and which half's wrong.
That is great.
And I thought that is not a message that is taught to most medical students. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people, I stayed at Johns Hopkins for, I was there for 8 years. And one of the reasons why people oftentimes never leave is because you're in that kind of an environment where you're encouraged to do something novel, and usually people don't, like for me, I made a big reach, usually people will do something that's novel, that's not quite such a earth-shaking kind of, paradigm shift. But for me, it was like, I didn't set out thinking I was going to change the paradigm like this.
Right.
It just presented itself to me, and I couldn't walk away.
Can I ask you a phrase that I read from Immanuel Kant when I was probably 30 that really opened my eyes, and I didn't understand it at the time. I do now. I think the society has changed so much. I do understand this now. But I want to ask you the question. I'm not going to ask you for details. I just Immanuel Kant said, "There are many things that I believe that I shall never say, but I shall never say the things that I do not believe." Are there things that you either believe but you're not ready to say, or are there things that you think you're on the cusp of going, I think a massive change of my thinking is coming that you haven't said yet?
Well, there are things that I haven't said yet publicly only because I'm reserving them for when my book comes out.
Okay, good. May I have you on the show then when your book comes back out? I would love to talk to you then. Are there things that maybe you can't put your finger on yet, but you have a feeling they're coming, that will be discovered, or what's the next big thing that you think you might see in your lifetime coming from all of this?
Oh, wow. That's a big question.
I know.
It's what I'm doing right now is I dream at night in ways that inform my theory. I mean, I'm that deeply steeped in trying to understand how it all works.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get this information in my dreams it's like eureka moments,
I know.
And so I've been in kind of a constant state of discovery like that.
Are you
And so it's like
Right.
I feel like I'm like a fountain in that
Right.
sense. So I know this stuff is coming. I mean, I know more stuff will come. That's part of what keeps life so exciting. But it's when we're in dreaming sleep, that's when it's that right hemisphere is dominant, and so the kind of processing that it's doing is it's very, very profound. And so then when I wake up, I'll either already have an insight or I'll analyze my dream and go, oh my God, that's what this means. And then I'll look things up and I'll find concordance in the literature, because I'm a multidiscipline, scientist. I'm weaving together all of these different branches of science that I had to study in order to become a medical doctor, whether you're talking about biology or physiology or anatomy or biochemistry or biophysics, or, I'm bringing together all of those things. And I'm also bringing together what I know from being a parapsychologist who studies the fringe stuff that people report that they're, they've either witnessed or capable of doing. And then I'm marrying that also with, what do we know about what ancient wisdom traditions and scriptures felt was so important for us to know, that they put the time and effort that it took back then to encode it, whether it's engraved on stones or painted with their own blood in a cave, or carefully recorded as scrolls that were placed in somewhere where they could be safe from the elements. It's like so I'm integrating all of these different streams and seeing how they all are sort of informing one another, and it's really I feel privileged to be in a position, to be able to do this, and I think in this way, this is one of the most exciting times to be alive, because it's so much easier to get information now than when I first started out as a scientist. I mean, my gosh,
I know.
It was before computers.
Yeah. Have you ever read Worlds in Collision by Velikovsky, scientist from Einstein's era? He was wildly wrong about many things, but his theory reminds me of you. He said, instead of science just rejecting everything, why don't we look for the myths and the religious traditions all around the world and see if they're saying the same things at the same time that would then tell us maybe not how they interpreted it, but would tell us something that, oh, this was probably happening in the world at this time. This was happening in the skies at this time, et cetera, et cetera. It's fascinating. I thought he was very brave for thinking out of the box. I want to invite you to come back when your book is out. I think you're a remarkable person, and I'd like to know, before I let you go, we spoke at the beginning that there's times when we invented the airplane. 3 separate continents, people didn't know, but you pierced into that. Have you found the people who are maybe going in the same exact direction as you are and are having these kinds of insights around the world? Is there anybody that you know of that has pierced this universal mind, if you will?
What I would say is that there are people who have there have been a couple of people who've contacted me or who've attended some of the lectures that I've been giving. And they're literally shaking like this. They're so excited because I came to insights that they came to, and
Amazing.
and they, when you find out that's more confluence, but when you find out that you're not the only one who's like seeing how these dots all connect together. Someone else is actually, is connecting the same dots, but they're not as public of a figure as I am, and they're thrilled that someone is doing this work, and so that is happening, and so I think that there's something in the whatever in the zeitgeist,
in the ether, in the water, or whatever.
Whatever. There's something happening here that it's like there's a pressure for the paradigm to shift, and a space that's being created for that to happen. So there's both the pressure for it and the space that's allowing it, and so we're really at a really exciting time, I think.
I'm a big fan. I can't thank you enough for coming on. I know this has been like pulling teeth. My schedule, your schedule has been like pulling teeth to get this interview, but I'd love to have you back on again when your book comes out. Very special work, and I thank you for sharing it.
You're very welcome. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.